So I recently recorded my first audiobook. I am the narrator of the LGBTQ History Book published by DK. This is an absolute dream come true for me. It is something that I've dreamt of doing for a long time, and it's finally real. So, this video is in two parts. I'm going to talk about the process of narrating an audiobook and how awesome it is. And I'm going to kind of review the book, because it's really cool that this was my first audiobook. Of all the books that could have been my first, the LGBTQ History Book is an important one for me. And so I also want to review and promote the book as an important piece of nonfiction. So let's go. I recorded an audiobook. What was it like? First off, my agent, Rita, at Spoken4, she got me this audiobook. And going in, I had a lot of worries, a lot of doubt about whether or not my voice was good enough for this, whether or not I had the talent for it. And one really minor worry, which I turned into a really big worry, is what I call meaty mouth sounds. When you talk, there is saliva in your mouth, and it makes little squelching and clicking noises. I sometimes notice them in my own videos when I edit them and try and edit them out. They happen to everyone all the time, and I was so paranoid about what I call meaty mouth sounds appearing in my audio, and that was immediately not a thing. As for having the talent, I studied theatre. My degree is in drama and theatre studies. I've acted on stage. I've written plays. So I should know how to do something like this, but I was still really worried about it. And I have a lot of people on YouTube all the time tell me that I have a great voice, that they like the sound of my voice. As a trans woman, that's actually been a bit of a point of contention for me, because part of me wants to feminize my voice more, and part of me doesn't, because I know I have a nice voice and people like it. But having a nice voice is not the same as being good at audiobooks, so I was worried about that too. In the end, everything was incredible. On a day last week where I had to go in and do a few edits, I talked to a guy who was a veteran at doing audiobooks, and he told me that a lot of people actually dream of doing it, do one, hate the experience, their dreams come crashing down, and they quit. And I said no, it was amazing. I loved every second of it. I really did. It was such a joyous experience. The thing is, I love reading. I think maybe a lot of audiobook narrators aren't big readers, I don't know, but I'm a book critic. I read, that's my main hobby. I read a lot all of the time. And so just reading out loud and being a narrator, expressing information to people, which is what I already do on YouTube, it's great. I feel like I'm made for it. And I certainly love doing it. The experience itself is quite interesting, because you're sitting in a little booth, you've got a glass window, and on the other side is an engineer, and you can hear the engineer through your headphones, and you can also hear your own voice as you speak, which is a little bit disorientating at first, and then you really get used to it. And you're constantly stopping and starting as you stumble over words and need to go again or mispronounce something, and this book in particular was really difficult for that, because it's a history book about queer culture from across the entire world and across all of human history. It's wild how much it covers, and that means there was a lot of pronouncing words from various different languages across the world, including languages that are now dead. So that was a particular challenge. For my first book, it really was a trial by fire. Everyone kept saying that. This is a really tough first book, because not only has it got all of these pronunciation things going on, but also it's a coffee table book, an encyclopedia-style book. It's not a book where you just read from the top of the page to the bottom. You're reading out and describing diagrams and text boxes and images and timelines, and things are all over the place. And there's a specific order that they want you to do it in. It was really fascinating, a real learning experience. At first I was shocked by how little ground you actually cover when recording, and obviously I got faster as I went, and I gained momentum, and I got used to it, and blah blah blah. But at first you spend 8 hours in a studio, and those 8 hours disappear. It feels like you're in there for 5 minutes while you're just recording. And then you find out you didn't record 8 hours worth of audiobook, you recorded 1 or 2. And then as it went on, I found that 8 hours was enough to record 3 or 4. And you get better and you get faster and things improve, and that was lovely. That was a nice experience. The engineers that I worked with two different guys, both of whom were just awesome people. So much fun, so informative, so experienced, so kind and patient and supportive. Just really, really lovely, nice people. And now I'm in a position where I really want more. I want to do this all of the time. It's a wonderful experience. I love the idea that my voice gets attached to a book, whether it be fiction or non-fiction. The idea of being the narrator, the person expressing that book, giving voice to it, giving it volume. I love that. It's gorgeous. I'm not very talented at fiction writing. I've written so many novels that I've just ended up throwing away after they get rejected 100 times. But the idea of narrating something by someone who's actually knowledgeable and talented and getting to add my voice to that book, that's a beautiful thing. So I like being able to figure out my talents, which I guess are speaking, and communicate that and offer that to the world of fiction writing and publishing and non-fiction writing, and it's great. It's lovely. Absolutely lovely. It's been an incredible experience. I loved narrating an audiobook, and I can't wait to do more of it. And I really hope you check out the LGBTQ+ History Book, which I will now talk about in a bit more detail. So I narrated the whole thing off my iPad, which is useless here. But this is a book that begins in 2400 BCE and takes us all the way up to the present day. And it catalogues and explains to us, the reader, all of queer history from so many different countries and cultures and religions from all around the world. The breadth of geographical and historical scope and scale here is incredible. When we think queer history, at least for me, and probably many others, we think of relatively modern history. We think of people like Magnus Hirschfeld. We think about pink triangles in concentration camps. We think about Stonewall. We think about pride marches. We think about the Lavender Menace. We think about the AIDS crisis. And if right-wing media pundits are to be believed, we think about how transgenderism was invented yesterday. But this book covers so much. As I said, you've got 4,500 years of human history here, across multiple different cultures, languages, religions, histories. Ancient Greece and Rome are of course covered here, but so are ancient China and Japan, and India. Native American cultures play a huge role in this book. There really is an enormous breadth, but I will say that it kind of acts like a cone, where at the beginning of the book, you have a relatively small amount of information about different areas, different places and times, and as you journey through the book, the amount of information gets broader and wider. So in the first half of the book, you might cover a century in 2 pages, whereas by the end, you're covering 6 months in 2 pages, because we have more information about modern history than we do ancient history, so it makes sense. And to a point, it's also more relevant to us and our daily struggles today as queer people. But the sheer amount that you learn about the people, the laws, the rules, the etiquette, social behaviors, it's almost endless. The very first chapter is called When Heroes Love, the earliest evidence for LGBTQ+ people, circa 2400 BCE. And we immediately move into ancient Greece. Achilles and Patroclus, the ways in which ancient civilizations treated homosexuality, transgenderism, etc., etc. For the most part, what I had to relearn as I was doing this book is that categories like homosexual and heterosexual and transgender and non-binary, none of these existed back then, but the concepts and the people still did. It's just the language was different. There was no categorizing people as homosexual and heterosexual. Instead, you had dominant and submissive. A man could be dominant sexually over both a man and a woman. And so you immediately think, okay, he's bisexual. But that's a term from today. That's not how they saw it. A man would dominate a man and a woman, and another man might be submissive, and a woman would always be submissive. So effectively, you've got tops and bottoms. But again, we're using today's language. It's fascinating to see how sexuality and gender identity don't have to be exclusively looked at through the letters LGBTQ, IA+. There are other ways of seeing it. Another thing I learned when getting into the modern history stuff is the cyclical nature of vilification. I've talked about this, and I've thought about this, and everyone's been talking about this for months and months and months now. The vilification of trans people in the UK and the US right now is identical to the vilification of gay men, especially in the 1980s, 1970s, 1990s. That's very out of order. It's the same argument, the same attacks, the same words being used, the same language, and people don't seem to notice, which is embarrassing. And so there is a real cyclical nature in the Western world. And the largest culprit when it comes to the damage done to queer people is religion, specifically Christianity. Christianity is almost entirely to blame when it comes to the way people vilify gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, etc. people. It's wild. This book also talks repeatedly about specific people, and the one who comes up the most is probably Magnus Hirschfeld, because he was gay and Jewish. He was the first person in Western history to study transgenderism and talk about people being gender non-conforming, etc., and famously his works were burned by the Nazis. That famous photo of the first ever book burning, his works are on that pile. He comes up a lot because if it weren't for the Nazis, we would have made a lot more progress a lot more quickly when it came to our understanding of and our support of the trans community in 20th century Europe. Religious texts are explored here as well. The histories of early Christianity. There's a lot of talk about people like Sappho. Renaissance Italy is covered in beautiful detail, as is the Ottoman Empire and its unique approach to sexuality and gender. The amount of cultures around the world that have 3 or 4 different genders, and quite often people who were intersex or transgender or non-binary or their version of those terms were seen as wise people. In cultures from Native Americans all the way across the world to the Maori people, you have intersex and non-binary people, or again, their versions of those things, being seen as something holy, something spiritual, something important to their culture. A group of people who have a particular kind of wisdom to share. It's so enlightening. As you get into the modern day, you start recognizing names like Anne Lister and Oscar Wilde. As you get into the modern history, there's so much about the punk movement, again about the AIDS pandemic, Section 28 during Thatcher's Britain, and something that really fascinated me as a trans woman was the ways in which second wave feminism treated lesbians. A lot of feminist groups made up of straight women didn't want lesbians in their groups because lesbians, to use their terms, butched it all up too much. Lesbians didn't look feminine enough and therefore hurt the cause of feminists. They were effectively lesbian exclusionary radical feminists. And this is again something people don't talk about. 40, 50 years ago, there was a version of TERFs who hated lesbians in the way that TERFs today hate trans women. Again, history repeating itself. They weren't called lesbian exclusionary radical feminists, but that's what they were. Lesbians were not welcome in feminist spaces, just in the same way that trans women often aren't today, even though every single decent trans woman today is a better feminist than any TERF, because being a TERF by its very nature is patriarchal. And every small chapter of this book is full of quotes by radical thinkers, philosophers, scientists, famous figures. There are diagrams, there are summaries, there are text boxes full of extra information. It's an encyclopedia, a coffee table book, and it's absolutely beautiful. I am so proud that I got to narrate this book, a book that has taught me so much about my own history as a queer person, a book that I would plead for anyone to read, especially people who are in any way anti-queer, homophobic, transphobic. They could read this book and actually start to feel something, learn how to empathize, learn how to learn. It's a book of simple ideas, an intense amount of history and geography and culture and religion stretched across the entirety of human history. And it's all focused on being queer in so many different ways. It's so inclusive. There are chapters on intersex rights, on asexuality. It goes on and on. Every facet of queerness is covered here across almost every culture and history in all of human civilization. It's incredible. Everything you've ever wanted to know about queerness in societies from the West to the East, from the modern day to the ancient, it's all here in this book. And I got to narrate it. I'm so happy and so proud. The physical book is currently out at the time that this video goes up, and the audiobook is out on the 11th of May via Audible and maybe other places, I'm not sure, so check it out. Obviously, I encourage you to listen to the audiobook. If I haven't mentioned already, it's narrated by me. But being an audiobook narrator is not a consistent job, so if you want to support me, you can do so on patreon.com/booksandbow, and subscribe for books.